All right, gang, welcome back to Chapter 10. We're going to talk today about long-term care. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about this book called Hearing Voices, a Memoir of Madness. It's by my good friend, Eric Coates. Eric and I met in high school, and we were good friends, had a lot in common, hung out an awful lot together, many good nights walking through downtown Keene well after midnight. We were kind of night owls, did a lot of fun stuff. After college, I lost track of Eric. This was back in the early 90s, pre-social media days, when you could still lose track of people. And he resurfaced, 20 years later with a harrowing story that he relates in this book called Hearing Voices, about how he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in his late 20s. He was hospitalized involuntarily multiple times. And if you're not familiar with schizophrenia, you just try to control it. You don't ever recover from a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, not all schizophrenics are voice hearers. Eric, unfortunately, hears them all the time. And he talks about how, desperate it made him to make them stop. So I want to share a passage. I'm not telling you anything here, out in confidence. It's all in his book. I do know more about his circumstances that I'm not going to share out of respect for his privacy, of course. But what's in his book is public. So I want to share this passage, and this is Eric talking in his book. After I told my mother that I needed her help in killing myself, she went into another room where I could not hear her and called the police. A few minutes later, sitting outside and smoking a cigarette, I saw the police pull up and knew that something was wrong. They approached. They talked to me for a few minutes. We understand you're having some problems, et cetera, then told me that I should put on my shoes and come with them. I refused to put on my shoes. Everything was fine, I said. I was not going anywhere. This was all a mistake. They told me I could put on my shoes or they would take me the way I was. Still, I refused. And then they took me by the arms, stood me up, put me in handcuffs, and took me away. So Eric, reached a point of desperation where he was prepared to kill himself to try to escape the pain that he was suffering from his mental illness. Eric is unfortunately, like many people, suffers from this disease and has, as I said, it's in the book. He's kind of cycled in and out of facilities and has, tries to maintain a life outside and manage his long-term issues with the help of his family. So I want to share this. I'm sharing this story and this bit of the his book with you to make the point that long-term care is not just about the elderly. It's really about anyone who is not able to care for themselves and is in a state of dependency. And Eric is not always in a state of dependency, but he cycles in and out of it. So let's talk a little bit about dependency. So what is this idea? Well, dependency is basically the loss of the ability to independently perform an IADL or ADL functions. We've talked about these, and I'm going to talk about them again here. So a caregiver is necessary because the individual can't perform those things on their own and maintain independent living. The situation can be temporary or permanent, and some individuals cycle between dependency and independent living, like I just mentioned. But and when we think about what's the purpose of the healthcare system or healthcare kind of thought of broadly, and it's really to maintain quality of life and independent living. So stole these slides from chapter 2, the chapter 2 lecture. So just to reiterate, ADLs, right, are the activities of daily living. These are the capability to carry out personal care. So personal care, really basic stuff. Can you feed yourself? Can you bathe yourself? Can you dress yourself? Right. These are the things these are very basic level functionings that you would need in order to function in a communal setting. So not even independently, but just in a communal setting. And so we evaluate ADLs when a person is potentially being evaluated, whether they need to go into a nursing home, and then if they're going to go into a facility, what level of facility. But also, we want to know, if we can keep this person in the home instead of in a facility, what supports, what long-term supports would this person need in order to stay out of a facility? So we're going to talk a little bit about that, right? So ADLs, these are the really basic level functioning that any individual needs. And then the IADLs are the capabilities necessary to live independently, right? So whereas ADLs really are about, do you need nursing care or not? IADLs ask, can you live on your own? And so some of the functions that you need to live on your own, for example, you've got to be able to prepare meals, you've got to be able to shop, you've got to be able to do some basic housework. These are things that if you can't do them, you can't live independently. Now, you could potentially still stay in your home. If your ADLs are okay, you might be able to stay in your home if your IADLs can be supplemented or supported. So I just want to bring back again that idea of capabilities as freedom. And we talked about functionings as doings and beings, right? Just that kind of funny wording that Amartya Sen uses. But really it's, can you do the essential things that, at a baseline allow you to survive, but at a kind of more complex level allow you to flourish? And so capabilities are those, again, the real and substantive things that we have to do in order to achieve the doings and the beings, right? The level of functioning, the level of thriving and flourishing that we want to achieve. So again, stolen from lecture 2. So let's talk about some of the limitations that can bring about dependency. And so, 2 broad categories of limitations are cognitive and physical, and very often those 2 things interact. And limitations can either be congenital, which means you're born with them, right? So you're born with Down syndrome, for example. You don't acquire it. You can't catch Down syndrome. So congenital, things that you're born with, or acquired, right? So acquired, so an example is you're in a car accident and you have a head injury. That's a combination of both physical and potentially cognitive functional limitations. And I've got an example of the Krempel Center in a little bit that I'll talk about. So cognitive impairment, right, are the limitations on remembering, learning, concentrating, right, making decisions that affect everyday life. A lot of this cognitive impairment, if you're cognitively impaired, the first thing that would wind up, being harmed would be your IADLs, right? Those things that you need to be able to live independently. When the cognitive impairment gets bad enough, your ADLs could also be affected, right? So on the other side, you have physical impairment, right? So these are the limitations on ADLs and IDLs from, some sort of physical disability. So examples I have down below each of our little spheres here. On the cognitive side, some examples are dementia, Alzheimer's, intellectual disability. So like Down syndrome is an intellectual disability. It's a congenital one. Autism, also congenital, right? Or physical impairment. So you might have loss of mobility. So maybe you were in a car accident and you became a paraplegic, like we watched the video of MR and I believe it was a diving accident that he broke his neck and he's now paralyzed from the shoulders down. So that creates a loss of mobility, multiple sclerosis, something that is a progressive disease, blindness, deafness, a lot of other kinds of physical impairments. So these functional limitations can create dependency, right? Where you need some sort of support in order to, from a caregiver, in order to continue to function. From the U.S. Census Bureau, I think this is 2016, so it's not that old. These are the types and prevalence of disability in a non-institutionalized population. So these are people who are living at home, or in a home, not necessarily at home, but home with family, or they may be living independently. So by age. So for example, it's by age. So the dark blue is ages 65 to 74. The light purple is 75 to 84, and then the dark purple is 85 and older. So 15.8% of people 85 and older who are living in the community have vision issues. So they're blind or serious difficulty seeing, even when wearing glasses. So this is not like, oh, I have to wear glasses. This is, even with glasses, I am nearly blind, right? So that's a serious disability. So we have hearing, ambulatory limitations, cognitive limitations, self-care limitations. So this is more addressing, this is an ADL, right? Difficulty dressing or bathing. And then independent living, this is your IADL. So they have difficulty going shopping, or in this case, going to the doctor's office. So you can see people who are 85 and older, almost half of them have some limitations on their IADLs. A quarter of them have limitations on self-care. So these needs can be met in the home, right, or in the community through community-based home and community-based services, which we'll talk about here in a second. So the goals of long-term care during dependency, first and foremost, is to maintain residual function. So what does that mean? Well, residual means if you've lost something, we want to keep whatever's left. So we want to keep you in health enough so that we can prevent further decline. We also want to sustain a high quality of life, and we want to return you to a state of independence if possible. But many people have conditions where they'll never return to independent living once they arrive at that point. And so you can have acquired conditions, or you can have congenital conditions, right? Most of these are acquired conditions. They've arrived as a result of aging or accident. But they are making the situation for the individual into a situation of dependency. The picture I've got showing here is from, you may have seen Northeast Passage activities around campus. So Northeast Passage is a community-based recreational therapy program, as well as sports program for people with disability, and just a wonderful program. But they work with people who have various disabilities to try to improve their quality of life. So if you are in a state of dependency, it's really important to get case management. And then to find appropriate long-term services and supports to help you maintain, retain, prevent any further loss, and retain whatever functioning you still have. So case management we've talked about, but from a long-term care perspective, it's evaluating kind of the patient's total needs. So this can happen in an outpatient setting or in an inpatient institutionalized setting, but we're going to be looking at the patient's total well-being in terms of physical, medical, and psychosocial. And psychosocial is quite important. People go downhill very quickly as a result of loneliness, isolation. These are terrible things for old folks. Having just gone through the COVID, our COVID year and a half, many elderly really suffered as a result of isolation. So psychosocial is not a thing to be taken lightly. So case management, you're going to be trying to determine, what are the needs and how can we meet those needs? Can the needs be met in the community, in the home, in the community, or is an institutional solution the best option? And then what resources does the patient have to finance this care? Because care is not, it's not cheap. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges to financing here in a minute. Long-term services and supports, abbreviated LTSS. These are the services that an individual requires to sustain those necessary functioning, right, and a reasonable quality of life. And these can be provided by professional supports. Very often, they're actually provided by informal supports. Case management can be done by a professional. If you're covered by a managed care organization, that's likely that would happen. But very often, a family member or other representative steps in. So, for example, a child caring for an elderly parent, or a parent caring for a severely disabled child. So along the kind of, again, having another continuum here, the way I think of long-term care is, on the one hand, we have people receiving long-term care in the home and in the community. And on the other kind of end of the spectrum, we have institutional care. And there's a blending. There's both a blending of home and community-based and institutional care, and there's people who cycle through both institutional and home and community-based care. So kind of starting from the far left with the community and based care, we have informal care. So informal care is that care that you gave to your grandmother or grandfather, right? The care that your parents gave you when you're sick. That's informal care, right? That's care that's happening in the home and is in an unpaid status. Some 92% of community dwelling residents receive informal care. And this is one of the challenges, right? So as you age, you shift from taking care of your own children to taking care of your parents. So a lot of kind of middle-aged people wind up finding themselves both kind of having kids still in the home and then having to also care for elderly parents. So we can think of some of the supports that allow people to stay in the home and in the community. Your book talks about Meals on Wheels, which is a service that brings meals to homebound elderly. So they may have difficulties with IADLs. And so one of the ways to overcome a challenge with being able to prepare meals for yourself, but yet stay in the home, is having a Meals on Wheels service. Homemaker services is another example, right? These are not healthcare services that are being rendered here. These are just basic, somebody comes in and cleans your house, does your laundry, things like that, that maybe you can't do because you're too old and frail. So this kind of fits broadly into the realm of personal care. Now, you watch the video about MR and his kind of a day in the life of a quadriplegic. And so you saw all the home health aspects of his life. So he's a quadriplegic living at home, and it's made possible by what looks like a fairly involved care team. So you saw he had a personal care attendant who was able to bathe him and bathe him and dress him and help him make transfers from his bed to his chair, right? And then he was able to go off and do some things on his own using technology, which is really awesome. He also had a visit from physical therapy, right? So there's other things that are happening there. So that's a fabulous example of what is possible with the right long-term supports put in place. So a quadriplegic person can live at home and not have to be institutionalized. But moving along the continuum, now thinking about community-based, but institutions where the person is not institutionalized. You can think of senior centers are an example where you're not necessarily getting medical care, but you are getting psychosocial care in the form of activities, preventing loneliness, and then adult daycare, a little more structured. And this is particularly useful. So this is where some of the continuum starts to get a little murky. So adult daycare, particularly useful for people maybe who are, for individuals who have dementia, Alzheimer's, who are still living at home, but we have, and maybe they're under the care of an adult child. The adult child has to work. And so the adult child brings the frail parent to adult daycare for the day. The child is then able to go to work, pick up the adult parent at the end of the day. Adult daycare typically has some therapeutic care involved in it. Adult foster care, you're now kind of moving into the institutional realm where you've got, and your book talks about this, so I won't go into a whole lot of length, but now you've got adults who maybe can't quite live on their own, living with families. So it's not necessarily a formal, they're not living in a formal institution. They're living in a home with a family. So like foster children, foster adults. Assisted living, now you've moved, but adult foster care is not medical care, right? So it is primarily oriented towards that personal care and providing the ADLs and IADLs. Right? Assisted living, now you're moving into a true institution, right? So these are formal institutions. They might look a bit like a nursing home, but they don't provide a higher level of skilled nursing. So they typically provide for things like 3 meals a day. You have community activities to work on your psychosocial needs. There may be some case management involved, but it's usually basically like an apartment, a very small, maybe an efficiency apartment, and you are monitored closely by the staff. So this is a situation where maybe some of your IADLs, are starting to go. You're having trouble shopping on your own. You're having trouble preparing food on your own, but you still have a fairly high level of functioning. So assisted living is kind of beginning to move into it is an institutional setting, but it's a very low level of care. The next level of care is skilled nursing care. This is what you typically think of for a nursing home, right? So this is, and nursing homes sometimes have a mixture of levels of care. So they may have assisted living around the nursing home, right? So you have different levels of need for a patient. So typically you're admitted to a skilled nursing facility when you have serious ADL challenges. So you have serious issues eating, feeding yourself, changing, doing basic personal care. And you need a high level of continuous monitoring and care. And then specialized care is kind of this next higher level of, it's still primarily nursing care, but it's a higher level of intensity. So you can think of people who are perhaps permanently on a ventilator would be an example of specialized care. So we have kind of, at this point, we're far into the institutional side of care. So that's kind of, to me, the continuum of care. On the one side, are able to function maybe in the home with informal care, gradually needing more supports, right? Maybe starting to need some, nursing care in the home, maybe some physical therapy in the home, but still able to stay in the home with appropriate long-term supports. Maybe getting some, as the conditions get more complex, maybe needing to put get day support, so that from say adult daycare, and then if there are no family members available, adult foster care, and then if none of those things are available, assisted living becomes kind of that next level of care where you can't live on your own. It's too much, maybe too much for adult family members to care for you, or you don't have adult family members that can care for you. Assisted living is a nice option. And then skilled nursing care really is when you need continuous care and you can't function in the home. Okay, so there's a couple of different thoughts about long-term supports. One is to think about it in terms of delivering LTSS in the home and community. So, this column talks about, okay, so what can be provided. So long-term supports can include medical as well as personal services. So we talked about, help with ADLs and IADLs, but also, physical therapy, other therapies like you saw in the video with MR, the young quadriplegic gentleman. Or that can all happen in a facility, right? So, if you're more seriously ill and require kind of the monitoring of round the clock of skilled care, maybe in a facility. Home-based, you're going to live at home, maybe with a family member, right? Maybe, you're an elderly couple lives together. One is more decline, farther in decline than the other, but, still able to, the healthier one is able to care for the younger one, or you live with, adult children, for example. Or on the facility-based side, you are with, in a nursing facility or an assisted living where the facility is designed to coordinate the care. And so where the care, where's the care given? It can be by caregivers who come to the home, or caregivers can bring the patient out into the community, again, for things like adult daycare, or, to see providers in offices. Whereas if you're in a facility, some people in the facility still, if you're in a nursing home, you may still get taken to appointments to see people, to see providers in the office or at the hospital. So once you're in once you're in a nursing home, it doesn't mean you never leave the nursing home for care, but a lot of the care is provided in the facility. And then how is it paid for? Right. So we have here on the home side, we have a lot of family members who provide care without being paid, but you can also, family members can be certified as, particularly if you're getting care, say from Medicaid, Medicaid is paying for it. Family members can be certified as caregivers and then reimbursed in part for their time. Because if you're caring for someone, for an elderly family member, for example, who's quite ill, that can turn into a full-time job. And so, it's cheaper for Medicaid sometimes to pay a family member to work as a live-in aide rather than, have to put the person into a facility. And so that's an option that allows a person to stay in the home rather than move to a facility. All right. An example of community-based services is the Krempel Center. So I'm very proud to be on the board of the Krempel Center. This is a wonderful organization in Portsmouth. It was founded by a gentleman named David Krempels. David was in a serious car accident and received a large insurance payment. And he used that money to start what has become the Krempel Center. And this is today what it has evolved into is basically a day program for adults with acquired brain injury. And so we have, they're located in, like I said, they're located in Portsmouth. I think they run 3 days a week of care. It's not adult daycare, but it is it's a mixture of therapy and community for people with acquired brain injury. So again, acquired, not congenital. So these are people who have the people who are members of the Krempels community who come and participate in the programming have been in car accidents and had a head injury, for example, like David had. They've had a stroke that has done both physical and or cognitive damage. And so we actually have a lot of our OT students and our rec therapy students do internships with the Krempel Center because this is a it is a community program, but it is also a therapeutic program. So it's a really great program. So I just want to rehash, right? Capabilities as freedom, right? So this is again back from chapter 2. So thinking about those capabilities, can you live on your own? What is it that society gives you to create the conditions that maximize freedom? So I talked about this before when I was talking about what is justice, right? And justice from a healthcare perspective. What does the community owe you as an individual? So a good society, I would argue from the capabilities perspective, is one that creates conditions for maximizing freedom. It minimizes interference with an individual's capabilities and protects individuals. So how do institutions fit into this capabilities as freedom, right? So we've talked a little bit about long-term supports on the community side. What about institutions? Well, you may have seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson. If you haven't, it's old, but it's good. Jack Nicholson is something, and this is a really powerful movie that came out around the time that the country was going through the deinstitutionalization process that we've talked about before. So the storyline happens. Jack is institutionalized in a mental health facility. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but he's, he's a difficult individual, but he probably doesn't belong in a mental health facility. This is an example of what's known as a total institution. In a way, so these old facilities were had complete control over your life and were fairly dehumanizing, right? And I would again go back to, history of our healthcare institutions has evolved over time, both in terms of knowledge, but also just in terms of wealth, right? What we were able to provide to the sick and injured and elderly has expanded as our society has become wealthier. And so these total institutions that the movie is making fun of, well, not making fun of, but criticizing, were starting to phase out when this movie was made. And so because in part of the fact that we were just becoming wealthier as a society, but also starting to understand things about mental illness that we didn't understand, until relatively recently. But you can think of so mental health asylums, right? Mental asylums are basically like prisons, except, you're likely to never get out. And so stories like this led to the deinstitutionalization movement that we talked about and you read about. And one of the questions today is, has deinstitutionalization gone too far? What do we do with individuals who are not able to care for themselves or manage their own health and don't have access to case management? And maybe if they are mentally ill, don't want to be cared for, right? And part of their illness is believing that they're not ill. Um, so total institutions, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this. This is not in your book at all. But this comes from a sociologist named Irving Goffman, writing back in the 50s, maybe early 60s. And the book is called Asylums. This comes out of a book called Asylums. So he's specifically talking about the experiences of living in a mental asylum where the control over the residents is complete. And so got a definition of a total institution. You basically have a large number of people cut off from wider society. So an asylum, you're putting somebody in a physical building, separating them from society for a long period of time, and they live a formally administered life. And so there's a few aspects of this. All the aspects of life are conducted in the same place and under a single authority. So there's I forget, I think the name, there was this terrible, the bad guy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is, I think, a nurse named Nurse Cratchit or something like that. And so in that story, the single authority was this one nurse, but it's really not so much the nurse as it is the organization that you are under the control of. Each phase of your daily activity is carried out kind of in a batch. So everybody gets up at the same time. Everybody eats breakfast at the same time in the same place. Then everybody goes and does something else together at the same time. And there's no individual control. The day is completely controlled out by the institution, right? By the authority, not by the individuals in the institution. And the activities are imposed from above on the individuals, and the individuals don't have a voice. And the purpose of the activities is as important, is designed to fulfill the official aims of the institution. So these asylums, right? Even this is an extreme example. I keep flipping back here, but mental asylums, the extreme idea here, the extreme story here is this awfulness. But at the same time, when we had relatively poor societies, that this might have been the best that society could do, given what they knew and the resources that they had available to them. So we can't be overly critical of that period. Now we know better. But there's some good criticism to be had that I'll come back to at the end here in a few more slides about, so we've largely done away with most of these institutions where people are involuntarily committed for long periods of time where they have very little control. And what we've evolved towards, so nursing homes used to be very similar to that. Nursing homes, historically, if you were in a nursing home, the nurses got everybody up at the same time. Everybody got fed at the same time. Everybody ate the same stuff. Then you got sent to do your activity with everybody. There was very little respect for the individual and individual needs. I'm showing you here the Edgewood Center. This is one of our local nursing homes. It happens to be run by an HMP graduate, so graduate of my programs. She's a fabulous lady, Trish Cummings. I did a podcast with her. You could have listened to. I don't think anybody listened to her, but she's a great person. And this is a fabulous, beautiful, family-owned nursing home, and there's a lot like it. But if you walk around the nursing home today, and there's some pictures of the facility, it's a lovely place. Like, I'm ready to move in right now. I'll let Trisha run my life. It's a beautiful facility. They take great care of the patients. And Trisha and I have had many discussions about the care philosophy at Edgewood. And I share Edgewood, but I'm also very proud that we have one of our alumni is the regional executive vice president for Genesis, which is one of the largest for-profit nursing home chains in the country. And he oversees, I believe, 90 facilities in New England. And there are several in the area, including one in Portsmouth, one in Exeter. where a number of my students have done their training. And so, Genesis also plays a critical role in the long-term care uh, long-term care spectrum in our country, in terms of what's available, particularly if you're in New England. That's one of the most common facilities. And Genesis is very good about taking Medicaid patients, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. But they do a great job with low-income individuals. So historically, nursing homes were very much in the vein of total institutions. These were institutions where people, lost a lot of their individual identity and well-being. You watched a video about Bill Thomas. I was going to say Dave Thomas. That's the Wendy's guy. Bill Thomas, Dr. Bill Thomas, right, about the Eden alternative. And so Bill Thomas has been a leader in the long-term care and specifically in the nursing home world for decades now. And he's really helped us re-envision what life in a nursing home should be. And he's got this trademarked concept called the Eden alternative. And so he's got these values that nursing homes can sign on to, and they provide training. And so they've got, it's a business. They sell these concepts, and you can get Eden alternative certified. But it's a really nice concept. And so Trisha and I have talked, about this, and she knows Bill Thomas, and he's visited her facility. They're not an Eden alternative facility, but she knows about it, and she embraces these values. We've talked about this. And so rather than running her facility like a total institution, the way Goffman described, in the way that really leading up to, into the 80s and 90s, very much these values were not put into place in your typical long-term care facility. So identity, right? Having, rather than treating you as a group of patients, you are an individual. The organization pays attention to your individual growth. And I think you've heard some of this in the video, right? Autonomy is really the core of this, giving people the ability to choose things. Even if you are very limited, giving somebody the choice giving somebody choice is critical to a sense of well-being and the ability to grow. So, and then meaning, I really like the piece on meaning in the video that you watched. Giving people an opportunity to participate in providing care in their community, because the nursing home becomes the resident's home. This is their home, and to not be able to contribute in some way limits their sense of meaning. And so I want to kind of close a couple of slides on the challenges facing long-term care. So one of them is, circling back to my friend Eric, is mental illness and the criminal justice system. Now, Eric, thankfully, has not really been involved in the criminal justice system, but an awful lot of people are. So we've had this process of deinstitutionalization where we had many people would have spent much of their life in an institution, were released out into the community, right? We set up these community health, mental health centers with the idea that anybody who is low income would be able to get community-based mental health services. The problem is case management, right? This is the crux of long-term care, is the management of the overall needs of the patient, the identification of what long-term supports the patient needs, and then making sure that they actually get them. So the problem here is for many of the people who are mentally ill, who would have been institutionalized, having been released out into the community, there's a lack of effective case management for them. And the result is this, this is from a Journal of the American Medical Society, JAMA. They talk about the mental illness incarceration recidivism cycle. So recidivism means you keep going back to jail. So from the article I'm quoting here, they estimate that 10 to 20% of jail inmates have serious mental illnesses. So and then 25% of prison inmates have serious mental illnesses. So we're talking about, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, and so forth. And the difference between jail and prison is, I realize if you're not into penal topics, jail typically is a community-based system, right, of incarceration, and typically sentences to jail are under a year. Prison is if you will, long-term incarceration. So this is typically your more serious inmates. So if you get sentenced to 10 years of prison, you're not going to stay in the county jail. They're going to send you to the state penitentiary. But the problem here is, particularly in the jail inmates who are the shorter term stays, right? You have these mentally ill people who commit crimes, wind up going to jail, spend some time in jail. Maybe they get some treatment, maybe they don't. And very often jail just makes their mental illness worse. Then they're released, they go back out into the community, they reoffend, and they're reincarcerated. So what really should be happening is they should be getting care for their mental illness. And, and unfortunately, because we have removed removed the institutional capacity. In other words, we've removed the psychiatric beds that we used to have. We wind up having a lot more people in the community who really need long-term care in the form of long-term psychiatric care, and they don't get the care that they want. And part of the problem is severely mentally ill people kind of fall through the cracks of our justice system, in part because their illness part of their illness is they don't think they're ill. So we have a challenge of mental illness in long-term care. We have a broader problem of demographics in the United States. So back in 1960, when when Medicare and Medicaid were created, we had a nice pyramid. We didn't have that many people who lived to be 85 and older. Most people, the reason that retirement age was set at 65 is because not that many people lived to be 65. And if you did, you didn't live a whole lot longer than 65. And so, having Social Security pay you some checks starting at 65 sounded like a pretty reasonable thing, because chances are you were going to kick the bucket not too long after you started collecting, if you made it to 65 at all. Today, and as we go towards 2060, but today we look a lot more like this already, frankly. But as we progress, as I get older and, hopefully make it into my 70s and 80s, 2060, I'd be 90. So you guys will be paying for my care when I get up to that age. Hopefully I'll get there. But the problem is we don't look like a pyramid anymore. We look more like a barrel or something, right? And in fact, I was just looking at some of the other census data saying that we are rapidly heading toward a point where we will have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 21 in the very near future. And so the problem there is, all the people above the age of 65 aren't working, or most of them aren't working. And so they're not contributing to financing public programs. Meanwhile, we have a lot of these public programs that we built, like Medicare and Medicaid, were built when we had a relatively small elder population. Now we have an enormous elderly population. And last slide. So going with that, this issue of financing, there's very little long-term care available insurance, excuse me, there's very little long-term care insurance available in the marketplace. And what is available is really prohibitive. My wife and I don't have long-term care long-term care insurance because it's so expensive. And this is really a demonstration of the death spiral that we talked about in the previous, I think last week. And the death spiral being, or was it 2 weeks ago? Gosh, time flies. But the death spiral, the idea here is who's most likely to buy long-term care insurance, the people who are most likely to need it. And so the people who are least likely to need it look at the price and they say, whoa, that's really expensive. I'm not going to buy that. I'm just going to take my chances. And then so that leaves the people who are more likely to buy it. The result is the insurance companies increase the price. So we have this, the long-term care insurance market is a good demonstration of the insurance death spiral that we have talked about. It exists, right? You can buy long-term care insurance, but it's crazy expensive for what you get. So if you don't have long-term care insurance, you should be saving money because there's a high probability that you're going to need long-term care. But most people don't do that either, right? Most people just kind of decide to roll the dice. And as a result, most people who are in institutions, that is nursing homes, right, are paid for by Medicaid. And that comes back to, I was talking about Genesis being an organization that accommodates a lot of Medicaid patients. A lot of nursing homes won't take you if you can't prove that you have the money to pay for your nursing care. Because once you're admitted, they can't just push you out. So if you run out of money while you're there, but you're still needing care, right? So let's say you're in a nursing home. Initially, you can pay because you have savings, and then you burn through your savings. At some point, once you become, well, at a point where you become destitute, meaning once you've spent all your savings and you have, I want to say the amount is like $2,500 you're allowed to keep in your bank, to have, in your bank account. At that point, Medicaid will kick in. And there's some other factors there. But at that point, Medicaid will kick in and begin paying for your nursing home care. But Medicaid, as we've discussed, pays very poorly. And so most nursing homes aren't terribly excited about taking a Medicaid, a patient or a resident who is going to be paid for by Medicaid. In fact, most of the time they'll just say, no, we won't take you at all. But Genesis is one of the organizations that generally will take Medicaid patients. So a for-profit firm finds a way to make that work. But the problem is, because most people don't buy private long-term care insurance, and they don't save enough money to fund their own long-term care needs, because they're just hoping that it won't happen. What winds up happening is you get hospitalized and you wind up having to spend down to basically to destitution. The problem here is if you're married, right, and your spouse goes into the nursing home and you have savings or you have a home, it can force you to sell your home, force you to spend down all your money to care for your husband or wife. And once you get once the couple gets to destitution, then Medicaid will kick in. Let's say now the person who has been in the nursing home finally passes. What is left now is the surviving spouse is left in destitution, right? In poverty as a result of the cost of nursing home care. So we have a problem with financing long-term care. Private sector doesn't do a good job providing affordable care. Most people don't save enough when they choose not to buy insurance. And so as a result, we wind up having government-funded long-term care. But it leaves any surviving spouse, again, destitute before it kicks in. All right, so that is some supplemental information for the long-term care chapter. The chapter is pretty detailed. There's a lot of information there. I just wanted to share some, what I thought were some interesting points.